Fulfill Radio, a voice you can trust. Broadcasting live presents Two Guys and a Bible with Don Preston and William Bell. Join us each week at 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central as we bring you exciting, sound, challenging, and comforting messages regarding the end times. Thank you for tuning in today. Don Preston is the founder of Preterist Research Institute, or PRI. Don is a prolific author, having written and published 19 books, a host of audio and DVD studies, and is a debater and defender of the full preterist view. His websites are BibleProphecy.com, Eschatology.org, and DonKPreston.com. William Bell is the founder of AllThingsFulfilled.com Ministries and has a website bearing the same name, and has authored 3 books, audios, and DVDs. He has published hundreds of articles and recordings. And now, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Two Guys and a Bible broadcast with Don Preston and William Bell. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Two Guys and a Bible right here on Fulfill Radio, voice you can trust. We're back for another week of Bible study and looking forward to engaging with you this evening. And with me, of course, is Dr. Don Preston. How are you doing, my good friend?
I am doing well, William. Doing very well. As you and I were talking about just before coming on the air, you know, you guys have avoided the COVID so far. My wife and I have been fortunate enough to do the same. We feel good. We pretty much stay in. We don't go a whole lot of anywhere. I go to the office and I work. But, of course, my office is locked to the public, and my offices are locked with me in them. And so, I do that. I go to the post office about once a week to mail off book orders. And beyond that, we don't get out just an awful lot. A few of the restaurants have started being reopened, and they've got distancing between the tables. And so we have ventured out for that a couple of times, not many, but we have done that, and it feels pretty good to get back out. But we're still being pretty cautious.
Yeah, well, I can understand. I mean, we're doing the same, but I think we're probably a little bit more laxed. We were quarantined after we got back from Africa for a while.
Right.
When that was over, we were anxious to get out. Even though the places that we went to eat, we could just sit in our car and they would deliver the food to us. And I think we probably went out to the first restaurant, or maybe we've been at 2, I guess, last few days. But other than that, that's pretty much been it. We've been homebodies and everything is fine. Most of the activity in our lives these days takes place at home. So it's not like, look, we've been on quarantine, I guess, all our lives for the last few years, for that matter, and so it hasn't been a big deal for us.
Yeah, my wife and I are not big on going out on the town, so we're kind of like you in that regard. Our main entertainment is going out to eat, and like I said, we have curtailed that pretty severely. And I told her, I said, wow. Not going out to eat, that's almost like getting a raise because we spend so much money on eating out. And so now that we've only been eating out once or twice a week, I said, wow, that's pretty cool. Now, she did inform me, and I may get in major trouble for this, William, but she has cooked more at home during all this COVID than she ever has, basically. And a couple of weeks ago, she had cooked at home about 3 or 4 times, and she said, "That's it. Not cooking at home anymore this week. You're on your own."
Well, I mean, Leora cooks occasionally, and not necessarily every day. When she cooks enough to last, so you're definitely going to have some leftovers. And then beyond that, pretty much you're on your own. So, I survive. Sometimes I don't want to eat that much, though, especially if it's heavy food. If I can find light stuff, I'm good. So, I'm okay.
Yeah. Well, William, I'm sure that everyone is interested in knowing what is the climate, the social climate there in Memphis over this George Floyd tragedy, just this horrific situation?
Well, I'm sort of out away from downtown, even though I did venture close to downtown on yesterday to do a little bit of work. And I saw 3 police cars racing down the street, sirens, just screaming, and they had barricades, blocking traffic. And I'm wondering what in the world is going on. So I saw the barricades, and I said, well, more than likely they're probably headed to the bridge somewhere. And then I did see the news later where there was some barricading, I think, of the inbound traffic from Arkansas, West Memphis, Arkansas, on the bridge. And I've talked to maybe one person that says that there are some things going on, but I haven't been that much into it, been too involved with other things to see. I have watched around the country in places, like Chicago, Minneapolis, and San Francisco, and places like that, Atlanta, where there is just a ton of protests going on, vandalism, looting, and just all kinds of aggravating situations, even at the White House, for that matter.
Yes,
so it's really something to see. The anger, the hostility that people are feeling at this point is, not only creating reactions in those who feel hurt by it, but apparently it's creating some reactions from people, or some actions, I suppose, from people who are trying to aggravate the situation for their own ends, and that's kind of tragic as well. I now have a tendency to keep up with things going on in Africa, and there are several embassies that are being surrounded, not necessarily surrounded, but, they're gatherings of people at several of the U.S. embassies in Africa, I know in Nigeria and some other places, because of this. So it's, a worldwide situation that's happening at this point.
Well, and it truly is sad and tragic. I made a comment or two on my video this morning, and I just pointed out, I said, now, I haven't seen all of the video, and you know me well enough to know that I try to be as objective and honest and fair in my assessment of situations. But, in the opening remarks of my video this morning, I said, from what I have seen, the video that I have seen, what I have seen was unmitigated case of murder. And that there should be absolutely no place whatsoever in the police forces of America of abuse, whether that be against the African American community, against the Asians, against the Mexicans, against Caucasian. There should be no abuse of authority on the part of the police. And what I witnessed is just absolutely appalling. And I did notice that today they have actually filed additional charges against the policeman responsible for that death. And I have to tell you, personally, I'm glad to see it. I was shocked when they said third-degree murder. I told my wife it should have been first degree. That, in my estimation, again, I don't have every single fact. I do not know if there were. I don't know if there was any video showing where he might possibly have been resisting, but every single piece of video clip that I saw, he was not resisting. He was not violent, and for that man to be treated that way, it's absolutely unconscionable. It is inexcusable and should be punished to the full extent of the law. Now, Americans, we have the right to protest, and I support those protests. But again, what you pointed out there is very true. There are a lot of people, and the outfit out of Oregon called Antifa, they use these situations like this to foment social unrest. Their entire goal is to destabilize American society. The violence that they commit. In New York, a policeman was run over. Another policeman was shot in the back of the head. All across America last night, policemen were being the targets of attempted murder. And so it's so tragic that some people try to use horrific situations like this to further their own political agenda, and if possible to destabilize our government. I mean, I'm sorry, as one pundit asked the question today, when you're going into a Walmart and carrying out on a cart 5 or 6 widescreen TVs, that really has nothing whatsoever to do with the death of this gentleman. That is pure unmitigated vandalism, it's theft, and it is anarchy. And it should not be tolerated. I don't understand why more of these violent people are not being arrested and not being prosecuted to the full extent of the law. There seems to be no enforcement of the law in situations like this. In New York City, they're basically evidently not arresting anyone. They're just letting them go, whatever they're doing. And how that can be allowed, I don't know. So we are in a very, very sad, very, very serious situation in our country. I just hope and I pray that some healing can come out of this. I hope that justice will be done. I hope that officer is prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. And not only that, I would go so far as to say, I think they ought to arrest the other 3 officers that were there and did not say a word of protest. They never even urged him to let up. And they even threatened one medic that said, he's passed out, let me tend to him, and they threatened to arrest them. And so I believe that the whole crew of policemen that were there ought to be brought before the criminal justice system and prosecuted. That's my personal opinion on it. It's just it cannot be tolerated, this kind of actions. And I am normally a real supporter of the police force, but that kind of action simply cannot be tolerated under any circumstances and anywhere. I just hope that our country can find some healing over this.
Well, I think it's going to take, a bit if the country is willing to face some of the long-term issues that, have driven them to this particular point. I agree with you that those other officers should be charged, and that, they were, in my opinion, accomplices to, what was just blatantly and openly a just callous, demonstration of a person just brutally murdering someone in public. It was basically a public lynching from my point of view.
Yes, I agree.
From that perspective, and but I think this is what happens over time when these kind of situations are ignored, when they continue to go on, and you get something like this, and I'm watching in terms of the whether you say it's the restraint from the National Guard, the police, the military police, and from everything that's going on, and kind of wondering about all of that. But at the same time, I'm looking at, well, if that happens, it's definitely going to make this whole situation worse. I think in view of what's happened, because people are still hurting and people are concerned. But the other side of that, and I've listened to lots of commentary by people on all sides of the issue, because I get tons of videos and notes from people, et cetera. And by the way, there was a case, I think it was in the UK, where there were 3 young men in a park, and 3 of them were not wearing a mask. And the policeman there apprehended 2 of them and put them in cuffs. And one person they didn't put in cuffs. And they were all 3 together, none of whom were wearing a mask. They were in this public place where I suppose they were supposed to wear it. And one guy was taking a picture of the whole scene, whole scenario. And the 2 who were put in handcuffs happened to be young black youths, and the person who was not was a Caucasian. And, of course, he questioned them the whole time as to why they were doing it, asked about the charges of the individuals, which they had no charges. They searched them, et cetera. And total violation of their rights in terms of what was going on, and just those kind of things. So I think we're at a point where, or at least should be, I should say, where the people who are silent need to speak up and speak out. You know, it's comfortable for people on both sides of the issue, but particularly the people who are not the victims of this kind of racism, discrimination, and brutality. I think it's incumbent on the people who do not or have not fallen subject to this to speak up and to speak out. And when that begins to happen, I think something will change, because, you know, it's hard for the people who are victims of it to have a voice in the first place. I mean, that's the whole reason that it's happening. They're not considered as even having a voice. It's disrespected. It's not, honored. And so, and that's not to say they shouldn't speak out. They should. But their voice is not going to be heard until others who are silent and who feel like, well, it's not bothering me, or, even though I don't agree with it, et cetera, there's got to be something done on both sides of this issue in order to do it. And that's the only way I think this country is going to heal over the long, dark past of its racial history and profiling, et cetera, that it, and image that it has around the world. I mean, this is not something that's contained in America. I mean, people bring out these human rights issues from every country, especially, when America sometimes touts itself to be an advocate of human rights. They go into other countries and destroy those countries because they claim that they are violating human rights. And the first thing those countries say, look at your own, go back and look in the mirror and see what you're doing. So there you go.
Well, I agree with everything that you said there. I think it is incumbent upon those of us who have never been subject to that kind of treatment. I grew up in an environment, thankfully, in which my father personally deplored racism. And it was not something that I ever saw manifested, thankfully. I did not grow up, and I was not in school systems that were heavily integrated. But what integration there was, it was perfectly peaceful. I was friends with the African-American students. I had no problems. I had no issues with them. And to my knowledge, they were never subjected. They were just part of the culture. And that was in Fayetteville, Arkansas, for crying out loud. That does not have the brightest history, I must add, when it comes to racism. And yet, maybe I was just simply fortunate. Maybe I was even naive. Maybe even a little bit blind. But I never knew of any bad, negative situations. And again, the African-American people that I was around, we all just got along famously. There were no issues whatsoever. My brothers and I attended for a good little while the black congregation of the Churches of Christ in Fayetteville, Arkansas, week after week after week after week. We were more than welcome there. We were asked to participate in the services, whether that be leading a song or leading prayers or what have you. We always felt just perfectly comfortable and perfectly welcomed. And we considered them, so what if they were a little bit darker skinned than we were? That had no bearing whatsoever on our relationship with them or theirs with us. And that's the way that we felt. And so as I grew older and began to be aware of some of those kind of attitudes, it was just literally appalling to me. And a very quick anecdote before we get too far into the program. While I was in preacher school in Harrison, Arkansas, one Sunday night, my wife and I were standing talking to one of the elders and his wife. Everything that I knew of them up to that point was that they were really good, warm, loving Christian people. And we were standing there just small talking. And about that time, now this is in Harrison, Arkansas, and that's when I very first began to see some really disturbing things. There were no African Americans living in Harrison, Arkansas, and that was in the 70s. And it was like, what in the world is going on? But nonetheless, we're standing there talking, and this African-American couple came in, very, very good-looking couple. He was dressed in a suit and tie. She was dressed up. Very, very attractive woman. Two really pretty young kids. And they walked in, and the facial demeanor, the facial expression on this elder's face was just underwent a radical change, and he just blurted out, "If those people start coming here, I'm leaving." And you know me, how quiet and shy and, reserved I am. I said, "What did you say?" He said, "If those people like that, if they start attending here, I'm leaving." And I said, "Why in the world would you say that?" I said, "Brother, let me tell you something. Do you think that's the attitude of Christ?" And I was his enemy from that point forward. I mean, I was his absolute enemy from that point forward, because I had dared to challenge his obvious hatred of anyone that had darker skin than him. And so I have not been exposed to an awful lot of that, but when I have, I've tried to speak out. I deplore it, and so I join with you in saying that those of us who have not been subjected to that kind of action and hostility in the past, we've got to speak out. Something has got to be done to change, quote, the culture, unquote. And by the way, there is racism toward Orientals. There is racism toward Mexicans. I know people right here in southern Oklahoma that when you're talking to them, they openly express bitterness, jealousy, and bias against Mexicans. And it's just, I just simply don't understand that. But we've got to speak out against that. I was thrilled. I don't know if you saw this on television or not. I was thrilled. There was a video of one police captain. I will use the word confronting, but that's not a good word because that has negative connotations. But he was speaking to a group of protesters who had gathered, and they had barriers up and what have you. But he was telling them, and this was all on video, I want you to know this police department abhors what we witnessed on that tape. We do not do that. We condemn that, and we stand with you 100% in your, in your anger, in your pain, in your suffering over this, and said, now, we will not tolerate violence, but what we want to do is we want to join hands with you, this police department, and he had, officers behind him. This police department wants to join hands, join arms with you, and we want to turn this protest into a parade. And the whole crowd that had gathered just busted up into applause and amens and what have you, and so they all took off together. And so here was a police captain taking a stand. And, let's face it, for one police department to speak out against another one is really, you don't do that when you're in the club. You don't speak out against your brothers. But he did.
Yeah, there was another incident somewhat similar. I think it was New Haven. I want to say New Haven, Connecticut, where a policeman stood up and basically, said the same thing to the extent that, they didn't go along with the violence that was happening. And one of the things that they did, he had the entire police force behind him. And he said, and as of today, he says, we are taking our vows, or pledge, whatever it is that they do in, becoming sworn in as an officer. And they all did it right there on camera to, basically say that, we're not standing for that. And here we are renewing our vows to uphold the law and to, uphold justice. And he says, and that's what this department is all about.
Wow. That needs to be done all across America. And
yes.
I did see an example of another situation, and again, I apologize for not remembering where it was, but one policeman had a black man on the ground with his knee on his neck, and one of the other officers came up to him and said, "Take your knee off of his neck," and forced him to do so. And so, these may be some small steps at this time, but as Zechariah said, many centuries ago, who has despised the day of small beginnings? Every journey begins with taking of a single step, and if more and more police departments, if more and more cities, if more and more people will start taking the stand for what is right, what is fair, what is equitable, and if they will re-examine their own attitudes about their fellow human beings, then perhaps, just perhaps, this could be a catalyst for improvement in our society across the board. I mean, across the board.
And one other thing is,
obviously we need it.
Yeah, I was just going to say, too, I watched, I think this was on Facebook, I'm not sure, I see so many of these videos, but there was one policeman who basically said, he says, look, one of the reasons I joined the police force was to make sure that this type of abuse doesn't occur. He says, it's not going to occur on my watch. If I see it or something like that, I'm going to say something about it or I'm going to do something about it. And that's the other thing is a lot of the policemen who may be good men, they don't say anything and they don't do anything when they witness these things. They could stop it, like you say. Those three men who were standing there, basically defending it with their passive-aggressive type of behavior, they could have stopped that, but they didn't. And then others who may be honest, but, either their jobs are at stake or something, they have to fear something as to why they don't do it and why they go along with it. But if they were encouraged peer pressure, if they were encouraged to speak up, speak out, and to take actions where their livelihoods and their jobs would not be at stake, but they would be rewarded for such behavior, because all that's going to do is make the force better and make it more responsible and accountable to the people that they, have been sworn to serve.
Yeah, peer pressure, and like I said, when you're in a club, the camaraderie among policemen is just like in the military. There's a camaraderie. You defend your brothers in arms, as the case may be. You never condemn. You never publicly condemn. But what's interesting to me is I noticed on one of the videos that the policeman that was standing close to it, he was very, very uncomfortable. He kept looking at the situation. He never said a word, unfortunately. But you could tell that he was very uncomfortable with what he was witnessing. You know that as a human being, he had to be standing there going, this is not good. This is not good at all. And yet he did not have the courage to speak up and to say, look, you need to take your knee off of his neck. You need to let the man breathe. We can cuff him and put him in a car, take your knee off of his throat. I mean, the man had his knee on the man's throat for 8.5 minutes, for crying out loud. He was
already cuffed.
Yes, he was already cuffed. But what I'm saying, put him in a car. But instead of doing that, he killed him. He murdered him. So I'm sorry. Like I said, I see no justification. I see no way to rationalize. I see no fairness. I see no equity. I see nothing that could be justified with what that policeman did. I saw total, overt, willful police violence and abuse of authority that murdered an innocent man. And again, no excuse for it whatsoever. And he ought to be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. I believe murder one is appropriate. I'm not the one that makes those decisions. But from what I saw, that was no accident. The body language that was on his face, that on his body, the facial expressions that he had on his face told me that he knew what he was doing. He was in a position of power. He was in a position of control, and he was not going to change. That's what I read. Now, I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a, obviously I'm not an expert in body language, but you know what? I'm not exactly dumb and ignorant either. And most people can have a little bit of understanding of what's going on when you're watching somebody by their body language and by their facial expressions. And that's certainly what I gleaned as I viewed that video. It's so disturbing. I mean, absolutely appalling to watch it, and to know that it literally did not have to happen. He had every opportunity to let the man up, to put the man in the car, restrained in the car. There's no excuse for what he did. But I've said that. So, now that we've made our social comment, and I've had several people ask me what I thought about that, so I wanted to express my thoughts, my feelings, my opinion on that. And we will see how that unravels. We will see if it serves as a catalyst for positive change in our nation. We can hope and pray that it does. In the meantime, William, back to Jeremiah chapter 3 and our discussion.
Well, before we get to Jeremiah chapter 3, let's talk about your debate with Sam Frost.
Yes, indeed.
I didn't get a chance to watch any of it, unfortunately, but I did want to hear a comment or two that you have concerning it.
Well, my personal opinion that I have mentioned to a couple of different people, I watched some of the debate that he had with Michael Miano. I watched some of the debate that he had, a good bit of the debate that he had with Holger Neubauer. And I just have to tell you, right up front, I was tremendously disappointed at the job, to use that term, that Sam Frost did in our debate. I had told my wife that I thought Sam might be holding something back, what he might think is an ace in the hole in his debate with Michael or in his debate with Holger, and that I felt like I was going to get his very best shot to debunk covenant eschatology. And yet, as I have stated, as I wrote on Facebook, when some people offered their comments, if Sam Frost would not have had his argument that said, just think about this, ladies and gentlemen, if Don Preston is right, then the church has been wrong for 2,000 years. If he wouldn't have had that argument, he wouldn't have had an argument. Or his other argument is, you just have to understand that Don Preston imposes his paradigm. He imposes his framework on the Scriptures. He creates this framework, and he brings it over here, and he imposes it on the Scripture, and instead of letting the Scriptures speak for themselves. If he wouldn't have had those two arguments, he wouldn't have had an argument. Now, the ostensibly, and I emphasize that word ostensibly, which means on the face of it, with an open view. The best argument that he made was on Philippians chapter 3, when he tried to argue that Paul said that we look for a Savior who shall change our vile bodies, plural. Well, I pointed out that the Greek of the text is body singular. And Sam Frost came back citing, supposedly, some rule of the Greek that he said was Greek Grammar 101. This is just basic Greek grammar demanding that it be translated as bodies, plural. Well, confessedly, I have said this many, many, many times. I am no expert on the Greek. I make no claim to be an expert on the Greek. And to be honest about it, I found his argument to be confused and confusing. I felt like at the time that he was trying to run a bluff. Now, I have caught him trying to run a bluff on the Greek, making arguments on the Greek before that I knew full well were invalid, they were improper, and they were false. And when I checked with men who are fully qualified academically to make comment on the Greek and on the arguments that Sam has made, they confirmed what I felt and what I even argued, and that was that he was simply wrong. He was abusing the Greek language. Well, I felt that way about his argument on the Greek of Philippians chapter 3, but I was also taking a lot of notes. I did not take down the full argument, the precise argument word for word, and so I was a little bit unclear about it. But I shared his argument with 3 different people, all of whom are better Greek students. One man is a PhD. The other man, he is no longer in that position, but at one time he was head of an organization in Washington, D.C. They worked with the ancient Greek manuscripts every single day to produce the most accurate Greek manuscripts and thus translations that we have today. I have the name of the organization in my files if anyone is interested in knowing about that organization and knowing this individual. The other individual is a man who knows the Greek because he was raised in Greece, and Greek is his complete, total background. I reached out to the first 2 individuals, the man with a PhD and who has taught Greek at the college level, and I told him what the argument was, and he actually spent 2 days looking at the text, going back over it with a fine-tooth comb, and he said there is no justification whatsoever for Mr. Frost's argument. The word is singular. It is literally the body of us. And even as I had already seen and already knew, the New International Greek Testament Commentary says that the word body is a collective singular. It is literally the body of us. The us comprises the body. Exactly like Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 6, when he said that we be many members, yet there is but one body. I mean, that's perfect parallel to Philippians chapter 3. But nonetheless, Sam made that point. I did not fully understand the argument that he was making. I knew the argument did not match up with the majority of translations. I knew it did not match up with the flow of the context, as I went ahead to point out. And yet that was probably the, quote, best, unquote, argument that he made. However, what was so incredibly telling to me, William, is the number of my arguments that Sam literally did not say one word about. Now, keep in mind, and I want to be very fair here, you know this, I know this, anyone who has ever engaged in formal debate knows this to be true. And that is, there's never enough time. Never. And what exacerbated that problem on those 2 nights of debate was that Chris Arnzen program, he takes about 3 different commercial breaks, maybe 4, and the commercial breaks are as long as the debate. And they're so disruptive of the continuity of the debate. Now, Chris apologized for that. He said, the contributions to our ministry do not pay for our airtime, so we have to have commercials. I understand that. I really do. It's a very difficult situation. And yet at the same time, in what was supposed to be a 2-hour debate, we each had about 35 minutes to speak. And that's really difficult to be in that circumstance, but it is what it is. And I don't even have my full list made out, to be honest about it. But the number of my arguments that Sam completely, totally ignored. You know, one of the things that he said was, you know, this view, preterism, is completely and totally dependent. Don Preston is totally dependent upon the time statements. Well, interestingly enough, I had actually made it a point not to use an awful lot of time statement text because I knew what Sam would argue. But nonetheless, I did use a few, but I did not base the entirety of my argumentation on time statements by any stretch of the imagination. So Sam Frost makes this comment that Don Preston completely and totally relies on time statements. It's all he has. He has nothing but time statements. Well, I pointed out in response that was absolutely false. I had appealed to a number of given texts, and I had, in my exegesis of those texts, I had not even mentioned a time statement of at hand, quickly, shortly, soon, etc. So in my rebuttal of that, I pointed out, I said, Sam Frost made a completely false claim. He says, I've done nothing but appeal to time statements. I said, now, let everyone pay very careful attention. I have appealed to a few time statements, but let me make some observations here. I appealed to Hebrews chapter 10, 37, and now in a very, very little while, the one who is coming will come, and he will not delay. And I said, all that Sam Frost did in response to that was absolutely not one word. And I said, now, Sam Frost talks about imposing my framework onto the text. And yet the reality is that Sam Frost has to pervert, destroy, mitigate, or deny over 230 time statements in the New Testament about the timing of the day of the Lord. So I said, who is it that is imposing their framework on the New Testament when they deny 230 statements about when the end was going to come? And he never responded to that. And, you know, passage after passage after passage, argument after argument after argument that I made, Sam Frost literally totally ignored it. I mean, literally said not a word in response. And to me, that was more than a little telling and revealing. He made some incredible, you know, just absolutely incredible attempts to argue and to answer my main argument. I argued from 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, where Paul says, so those of you who are troubled, rest with us when the Lord Jesus shall be revealed from heaven in flaming fire, taking vengeance on those that do not know God or that do not obey the gospel. I pointed out that Paul was writing to first century Christians. They were being persecuted. They were being persecuted by the Jews. Paul promised that God was going to turn the tables on them. They were going to become persecuted, and the Christians were going to receive relief. And I pointed out that the Greek word that is translated as rest is onesis. It doesn't mean comfort, and it does not mean consolation. It means relief from pressure. Anytime, and I pointed this out, anytime that onesis is used with thalipsis, these words are antonyms. Whatever pressure is in the text, doesn't matter what it is. As I pointed out, it could be the pressure of childbirth, John chapter 16. It could be financial pressure, 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and following. Doesn't matter what the pressure is. Onesimus is relief from that pressure. And that means that the Thessalonians were going to get relief from that persecution from the Jewish persecutors when the Lord Jesus is revealed from heaven. Now, keep in mind what I said a moment ago. Sam Frost said, if Preston is right, then 2,000 years of church history is wrong. Sam Frost argued that 2 Thessalonians chapter 1 is not a prediction of the second coming of Christ. Now, I should have said it. I didn't have time in the rejoinder. But I should have said, just keep this in mind, ladies and gentlemen, if Sam Frost is correct that 2 Thessalonians chapter 1 is not a second coming passage, then the church has been wrong for 2,000 years, because the church has consistently taught, it's in the creeds, it's in church history, it's in the patristics, they have applied that passage to the second coming. So here's Sam Frost that scoffs at preterism, saying, oh, if preterism is right, the church has been wrong for 2,000 years. But here's Sam Frost saying the church has been wrong for 2,000 years to apply 2 Thessalonians chapter 1 to the second coming. That was the sort of self-contradiction and inconsistency that Sam manifested during the entirety of the debate. And then amazingly, Sam argued, well, Preston says it was the Jews that were persecuting the church, but that's not accurate. Paul said in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, 15 to 16, that it was the countrymen of the Thessalonians. Therefore, it's not the Jews. Well, I rejoined to that very quickly in my place, and I said, well, that's strange. Acts chapter 17 lays the responsibility for the persecution at the feet of the Jews, but I said, I guess, according to Mr. Frost's logic, just because the Jews lived in the same country as the Thessalonians, and even though they lived in the same city as the Thessalonians, that because they were called their countrymen, that means they couldn't be Jews. I mean, that's the kind of logic this man used. And well, you can't, I'm sorry, I want to be kind, but you can't call that logic. There's nothing logical about it. You know, I live in Ardmore, Oklahoma, and everyone that lives in Ardmore, Oklahoma is my fellow Ardmorite. I mean, it doesn't matter what their nationality is, they're my fellow Ardmorites. So for Paul to refer to the countrymen of the Thessalonians as the one guilty of persecuting them, it doesn't speak to their nationality, it speaks to the country they live in. But again, that's the kind of argument, if you want to call it an actual argument. It's a deflection, it's obfuscation, it's an attempt to avoid the force of the argument, but it has no validity whatsoever. And so that's sort of kind of the way the debate went. He literally scoffed. One of the questions that he asked me was, if Satan was destroyed in Revelation, then how can you say that there is evil today? Do you believe that Satan exists? And I said, no, Satan was destroyed. And his challenge to me was, well, if Satan was destroyed, then how is there evil in this world? And I said, well, the problem that is being expressed here, the underlying presupposition, is that Satan must always be identified as a spirit being. And I said, but make no mistake, the word Satan, in the Hebrew especially, simply means adversary. And I said the adversary may refer to a spirit being, and I didn't take the position one way or the other, whether or not Satan was a spirit being. I just simply said that a person could argue that Satan was a spiritual being. I said, or they could understand that Satan was simply an adversary having nothing to do with a spirit being, such as in Luke, when Peter withstood Jesus and said, Lord, you're not going to be crucified. You're not going to be slain. And Jesus said, get thee behind me, Satan. Well, I'm pretty sure that Peter was not himself the spirit being called Satan and the devil. I pointed out that from Revelation chapter 2, that speaks of the synagogue of Satan, Revelation 2 and 3, that it was the synagogue of Satan that was going to cast the Jews into prison, the Christians into prison. But I was real sure that it wasn't the literal being Satan that was going to do that, and that conflating Revelation chapter 2 with Revelation chapter 12 shows us that the adversary was Old Covenant Israel. Oh, my goodness gracious. You would have thought I came up with a brand new doctrine on my own making that argument. He says I actually flip-flop. And I said, no, I did not flip-flop. I was very careful to point out how the word Satan is used. I said, you're the one that is refusing to acknowledge that Satan does not have to refer to the spirit being that we normally think about. And his question was, well, it still comes down to the question, if Satan was destroyed, how can there still be evil in the world? And I said, well, unfortunately, Mr. Frost is misunderstanding or ignoring or abusing Hebraic apocalyptic imagery. I said it's perfectly legitimate for it to be argued that the Satan that is in view, and I said that would be Old Covenant Israel in the book of Revelation, but that Satan was destroyed, but that does not mean that there would not be additional adversaries, opponents down through the centuries. I said that's perfectly legitimate Hebraic apocalyptic imagery that Mr. Frost is simply scoffing at and ridiculing, but that does not prove his case. So I just told him, I said, I haven't flip-flopped even a bit. I'm just setting forth the premises that are absolutely true. So I pointed out, I made the comment, Mr. Frost needs to understand, the audience needs to understand, ridicule, which is all that Mr. Frost did, ridicule is not refutation. It's not an argument, it's ridicule. And at least twice, William, during the debate, and the rules of the debate were very clear. Chris Arnson stated them before the Q&A session, both nights. He said, when you're asking a question, you do not preach and you do not exegete. You ask a question and, I mean, this is not the way he said it, but the gist was, you ask your question and you shut up. Well, on both nights, pardon me, Sam Frost would ask a question, and then he would go off into this lengthy discourse, taking up my time, mind you, into this lengthy discourse about how evil Preston is, how evil preterism is. And on both occasions, I just said, Sam Frost, you've gone to preaching in violation of the rules. You need to ask your question, and you need to hush. It's not exactly the way I expressed it, but that was the point. I said the rule is you ask your question, you do not preach, but you started preaching. And I said that's a violation of the rules. Unfortunately, Mr. Arnson did not call him down on that, although I will say this, on the second night, Mr. Arnson was even more emphatic as he stated the rules. You do not preach. You do not exegete a passage, and you do not make arguments. You simply ask your question. And Sam violated the rule again. The demeanor of the debate was very respectful. I didn't expect Sam to get out of order or out of the way. I did expect him to try to pull a few debaters' tricks that thankfully he did not do. He pulled a few, to be honest about it. Anybody that knows anything at all about debate knows some of the tricks that he tried to pull. But all of that aside, overall, the demeanor of the debate was very good. And I want to let everybody know that this upcoming Friday, we will have a follow-up program of 2 hours that will be strictly Q&A for people to call in to the program and ask questions that Chris Arnzen will then read to us, and Sam and I will give our responses to that on the program. And so once again, that's this upcoming Friday. I've forgotten what the date is. 5th? Okay, that will be June the 5th, and it will be from 3 to 5 Central Time. Obviously 4 to 6 Eastern Time. So if you get the opportunity to do that. Now, for those of you who have contacted me, and there have been a bunch of you, for all of those people who have posted on Facebook, and there's a bunch of them, who have said, where's the link to the debate? Where can I listen? Where can I listen? All I can tell you is that's the responsibility of Mr. Chris Arnzen and his technical people to get that posted. The last that I knew, it had not been posted. I have been told that sometimes Mr. Arnzen is slow about getting the programs posted. I hope that there will be no delay in getting the debate posted, so that, I mean, there have been a serious number of people who have expressed interest in wanting to listen to that. I do know some people taped it, and so, if all else fails, perhaps that can be made available at some point. But in the meantime, we're waiting on Chris Arnzen to post the debate in the archives. And the program is called Iron Sharpens Iron. www.ironsharpensiron. And so you want to check that out as soon as you can. Hopefully, like I said, the debate will be posted in the very, very near future. William, I've got to tell you, to me, one of the most powerful points during the debate was Sam trying to argue for resurrection. And I went to the little apocalypse, Isaiah 24 to 27. And I marched down through doing an exegesis of the text. And I pointed out that the passage posits the salvation of Israel, which is the resurrection, at the time when the fortified city would be made desolate, when the temple altar would be turned to chalkstone, when the people whom the Lord had created would no longer find mercy, the people because they were of no understanding. I pointed out that was taken directly from Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 18. Deuteronomy 32 was a prophecy of Israel's last days. I emphasize this repeatedly. It was a prophecy of Israel's last days, not a prophecy of the end of time, not a prophecy of the end of the Christian age. So I said, here is the inspired writer of Isaiah putting the resurrection at the end of Old Covenant Israel's covenant history, when Jerusalem and the temple would be destroyed, and and Israel would be destroyed. Sam Frost totally ignored it. I kept pointing out to the audience. He ignored it. And I made the comment. I said, Sam, the language is explicit, it is emphatic, it is undeniable. You need to deal with this. His response to that was, well, the language is explicit. That was his response. I mean, it's explicit. And it explicitly refutes your futurism. That is how explicit it is. But Mr. Frost resorted once again to, if Preston is right, the church has been wrong for 2,000 years. And he said, you can go to any church. You can go into any church on Sunday, and you know what death means. You know what body means. And I said, well, yes, that's because of 2,000 years of indoctrination. But that simply elicited more ridicule from Mr. Frost and the claim that I impose my framework. But as you and I well know, what we try to do is try to restore the proper definitions. And that's what I was doing on Isaiah. And I pointed out according to Sam Frost, there's only one kind of death mentioned in the Bible, and that's biological death. And I said, I want everyone to think about this. Jesus said, if a man believes in me and keeps my saying, he will never die. Therefore, according to Mr. Sam Frost, anyone who believes in Jesus will never die biologically. And we're out of time. So that's my very, very, very quick rundown on the debate with Sam Frost. Don't forget the upcoming Q&A session on June the 5th. William, great to be with you, as always. Folks, thank you for joining us right here on Two Guys in the Bible on Fulfilled Radio, a voice you can trust. And with that, I'll say good night and God bless.
Thank you for joining the Two Guys in the Bible radio broadcast. On behalf of Dunn Preston and myself, we'd like to say have a very pleasant day and may God bless. Until next time, we'll see you on Fulfill Radio, a voice you can trust.